Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan, and recently we spoke about Nippon, a nation which is not featured on the Immortal Empires map, but we expect to be featured a few years down the line. And that was a really fun video to create, as it allowed me to explore a lot of older lore and just have a little bit of fun, which to be honest is the main reason why I actually do these videos. So I wanted to turn my attentions towards a nation which is currently featured on the Immortal Empires map, which is not accessible at the very moment, which is the Kingdoms of Ind. So, yeah, don't worry, we'll talk about Koresh in another video, but the Kingdoms of Ind, out of all the three missing major powers on the east, is actually the race pack that I want the most. Yeah, I know a lot of people want Koresh because of Snake Men, or Nippon because of Samurai, yet I want Warhammer India more than those two. Well, in all honesty, I want them all, but yeah, let's talk about the Kingdoms of Ind. So we'll start with a landmass like before. The Kingdoms of Ind is a very large area of land which borders the territories of Grand Cathay, the Mountains of Morn, and even the Darklands. A little bit too with Koresh, but you know, it's just from a short boat ride essentially. As this is Warhammer Fantasy, it is obviously taking inspiration from our own real world India, and then just distorting it in terms of size and so on, because that's how Warhammer Fantasy was based on. As you can see, it's actually very large. It's not as big as the Empire, for example, but it is definitely large enough to have a sizable population and its own unique cultures, units, and well, pretty much everything else. Now, in terms of canon lore, the Kingdoms of Ind have actually existed for a long time. Pretty much as long as there's been a world map existing for the setting, there's been the Kingdoms of Ind, and they've gotten updates over the years, not a lot, because they weren't really their own official army, but they did get a lot of lore to just kind of fluff them up a bit. Many army books, all the way up to 8th edition, also did mention the Kingdoms of Ind, mostly because there was a lot of Dark Elf lore and stuff that related around that, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And a big thing for the Kingdoms of Ind was that they did get a lot of lore through Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, specifically 1st and 2nd edition, but there's been some new lore creeping in through the new edition in Warhammer Fantasy roleplay 4th. But unlike the other human nations like, say, Cathay or even Nippon, Ind itself didn't get fleshed out in the same way. Ind and Cathay were getting some units, and they did have quite a lot of stuff everywhere, which kind of centralized a actual race, whereas the Kingdoms of Ind got mishmashes of lore in different locations, which gave us context, but not a lot of context overall. Because of this, we don't really know too much about standing armies and so on, but we do know a few things. So as you can imagine, a lot of real-world stuff does peek over to Warhammer Fantasy, and for Ind it's exactly the same, though interestingly enough it's mostly focused around their Pantheon, without counting the usual stuff, and yeah, not a lot of puns, interestingly enough, for a country in the far east of the Warhammer Fantasy world, which you'd think would be a bit more joked about as they did with Nippon. Games Workshop actually went more on the same route as they did with Grand Cathay, where they introduced stuff, but it wasn't just punny. So we do know of 3 gods. One is Brahmir. We don't really know too much if it is actually a god or not, but it's likely based on the Hindu god Brahma. I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing stuff, by the way. We do have another deity known as Shere Khan, which, you know, is likely named after Shere Khan from the Jungle Book series. And there's another entity known as Gilgadresh, which, as you can imagine, takes its name from the Epic of Gilgamesh. But other than that, not too much information regarding the deities of Ind, which is actually very curious, considering that this area is known as the Land of 1,000 Gods, which, even though we barely know anything about the Pantheon, it is rather interesting to know, considering that obviously real-world India has a lot of deities and so on because of all the different types of mythology there, and obviously all the large amounts of religions there, which would show a lot of diversity in terms of faith, which could even bring in a lot of different creatures that we could fight in if these guys ever got created into a DLC. Now, I do think that they're going to happen, but we're going to talk about that later on. Now, they have had a lot of relations with a lot of different factions and nations within the Warhammer Fantasy world. We know, for example, that they trade very often with the nation of Araby, which kind of makes sense as everything goes to Araby and then gets moved into Empire and Bretonnia and Talia and so on. It's very likely that they've also had trade with Empire, Bretonnia, mostly because we know that there is a fairly large amount of Indian people can be found within the territory of Marienburg. Surprise, surprise, a lot of human nations from all across the world will have themselves having a centralized trade hub in Marienburg. Marienburg is known as like the one place where trade can kind of pass freely. The Dark Elves, we know, obviously had a lot to do with Ind, mostly because, well, you know, Ind is a nation that is situated right on the coastlines, so the Dark Elves will raid it often, with Lokia Felheart having his magical blades actually forged from Indian steel. So there's a lot to do with the Dark Elves. We can kind of expect some minor factions in that location too. Hell, if Ind ever opens up properly, I would love to see Lokia move that way. Ogres can be found through that region, but then again, ogres are pretty much anywhere around the world. The High Elves have had many skirmishes versus the people of Ind. They will trade, but there are certain cases where the people of Ind, more so their very interesting monsters that we'll talk about a little bit later, are quite defensive of these areas. Keep in mind, if this is known as the Land of 1,000 Gods, it's very likely that there's many temples around the area, so you do need to be careful of where you go to, as you might go into an area which might be deemed, you know, sacred, so unless you are a practitioner of that faith, you wouldn't be allowed there in a sense. Chaos is obviously going to be known around that area because, well, you know, a human nation is going to attract the perverting powers of the Chaos Gods. So we know there's a lot of beastmen there, not just the beastmen that we're used to, but very exotic looking beastmen that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But we can 100% expect Chaos cults there, beastmen, and possibly even demonic influence, as maybe some of the demons in that area will try to create a false representation of an established deity in an effort to make them fall to chaos, which, you know, happens a lot more often than people think. A bit of interesting lore, which has come in actually rather recently, is the fact that the Skaven are very active in Ind, which obviously makes sense. Any human nation is going to have a Skaven. However, it seems that the Doom Rocket, something that you guys are already well versed with, you know, it's the big nuke that Ikit Claw uses, well, that was a piece of weaponry that the Skaven adapted from stuff that they saw in the Kingdoms of Ind, which very much means that, well, nuclear Gandhi from Civilization is a thing in Warhammer Fantasy, which is actually kind of funny. But yeah, this means that they're going to have a lot of firepower, and we'll talk about the Ind army later on. But this was something that I feel like is quite important because, again, nations in the Far East, which generally didn't get that much lore, are getting loads of updates recently, and I think that's very important to talk about. Even if it's only a few sentences here and there, it's still an update that makes them remain in canon. Now we have to go back to the Beastmen, because the Beastmen form a part of everyday life to the Kingdoms of Ind, and it's not very much the same as, say for example, the Beastmen in the Empire, where everything is more aggressive. It's a bit more relaxed, in a sense. This quote from the Tome of Corruption actually really puts it in a very interesting perspective. While traveling to the lands of distant Cathay, I first passed through the strange land of Ind. What wonders I have seen, fabulous temples, great white beasts with trunks and tusks, and that walk on all four legs. Birds of every color and the cuisine. It takes my breath away just thinking about it. Anyway, while in Ind, my company had the misfortune of being attacked by an odd race of creatures. I believe they are somehow related to our own beastmen, as they combine the features and form of both man and beast. But these vile creatures were different. They had the heads of great cats, larger versions than the ones stalking the night in the streets of our grand empire, mounted on a naked human body. Stronger still, while we fought for our lives, our native guides just dropped prostrate to the ground, ignoring our cries for help, unmindful of the beasts as they tore through us and our guides alike. Luckily, through my own skill with the sword and the pistol fire from my companions, we beat back the rude host, sending them scurrying into the woods. After, I flogged our guides, remonstrating them for their cowardice, as any master should. Weeks later, I learned that these creatures are something akin to holy spirits to the natives, and that if we injured any, we should be on the lookout for an attack. Thankfully, I ended their service when we returned to town. It's odd though, I'd been experiencing stomach distress. Probably because of this infernal fare they pass for food. It does take a while, but yeah, we do have a little bit of a curry joke there, because curries and stuff do kind of make you go to the bathroom a bit. It's the spices kind of act like a natural laxative. Still, a good curry in a good afternoon is just fantastic. Anyways, let's continue. So this was in reference to the Tiger Men of Ind, which is something that we know is a thing there. We know that animals are worshipped there like deities, and we do have some interesting beastmen there, which seem not to fall around chaos chaos, but rather their own thing. Obviously, there was confirmation of elephants and stuff, which is big hype because I won elephants in Total War Warhammer. And no, mammoths don't count, I won proper elephants. But let's actually get back to the Tigermen. So, we know that they actually trade with the people of Ind too. It's something very interesting because mostly we've seen beastmen to be very chaotic, whereas these seem to be more extensions of the many thousands of gods within the Kingdoms of Ind, kind of like avatars in a sense. And these still remain in canon, as in an interview with Andy Hall, when we talked about Grand Cafe, there was actually mention of the Tigermen of Ind. Hell, they're even referenced in the campaign map for Immortal Empires, where we got the village of the Tigermen inside Grand Cafe, so we actually know more or less where they might actually have a base of location, essentially. Now, we know of a little bit of other lore where we have tiger-headed warriors again, prides of winged lions, that should be quite interesting, and six-armed monkey warriors. This is something very, very faint in the lore we don't really know too much about, yet it suggests that the Kingdoms of Ind itself would be very high fantasy compared to a lot of other locations in the Warhammer fantasy world, where most humans, say for example in the Empire or even Bretonnia, will mostly stay around other humans, every now and then working with elves and dwarfs, mostly with dwarfs. Ind seems to be more open-minded. More likely, this is more of a theory, that these creatures will be representatives of their deities, so they are more active in a sense, and we're going to go into that theory a little bit later on in the video, but it's actually quite important to know because, yeah, I mean, a high fantasy race within this area, which is more low fantasy in the universe, more, well, not low fantasy, mid fantasy, but you get what I mean. But the last thing that we do kind of see within the Kingdoms of Ind are vampires, and this is because, well, any human nation within the Warhammer Fantasy universe will have some sort of vampires there. We know of one specific vampire, which is Maztices, who is the leader of the Matmasi bloodline, but we don't know too much, though it's very likely that they're still going to get mentions. This is a really big thing in the future where old lore is coming back, so as long as it's not offensive, it's generally going to come back anyway. And vampires make sense. Again, any place that there's humans, there's going to be vampires because they're a food source. Now, that's everything that we kind of know about the Kingdoms of Ind right now. We do also know that there's multiple kingdoms, hence the name, so it's not just ruled under one specific person. In fact, we do know that there's a title known as a Raja, which is a king within that land. It could be an interesting aspect where it's in a very similar sense to the Empire, where all the different provinces actually govern themselves. There might be one specific godhead, which could be quite interesting to lead everything, but it would be just a god rather than a person. Especially from the little bits of lore that we do know again, this is a very magical place, which is kind of interesting. We're kind of expecting a lot of magic anyway, because, you know, this is Warhammer, but apparently people are actively calling it a very magical place. So if other people are saying that, these are people inside the universe, you know, written in the perspective of that person, then this should be something that should be very, very curious and wondrous to see, right? Army-wise, we know nothing, which is kind of like Grand Cafe. It's more of a blank slate. Now, obviously, we do know that they have some form of gunpowder because they're able to make rockets, and we know that they make use of creatures which are very magical, you know, these six-armed Monkeymen, the winged lions, the Tigermen, but I always envision it as a mix. We're going to get into the envisioning part later, but it can be assumed that yes, there are going to be a lot of humans within these armies too, because it is a human nation. So yeah, we can see a lot of similarities if it ever gets created into a DLC form as, well, Grand Cafe, the Empire, a little bit of gunpowder here and there, a little bit of weaponry. We know that they make use of, say, for example, the scimitars. It's a common thing there. The Indian tulwar, which is another type of sword. It's not a lot to go through. It's really not. But hey, when you start taking into account actual Indian history and mythology, then you can start creating something more fantastical, right? So with everything discussed in the past 14 minutes or so, what you can tell is that Ind was established, but not so much like Nippon was. It was rather more so like Grand Cafe, where a lot of bits and bobs were added in different directions in an effort to flesh out the country a lot more. which we do get a decent amount of information, just it can be considered rather bare, more so like a blank slate, which makes me believe that this would be a great way for a DLC. Now, I do believe that we're going to get everything in the future. Ind, Koresh, Nippon, hell, even the Dogs of War, Talia, Estalia and all that, but it's going to take some time. But Ind itself is so fresh, since we know nothing, next to nothing about it, military-wise and so on, that it could very much allow artists, writers, everything really, just to go ham and have a lot of fun designing this particular faction. I do believe that this is something that Games Workshop and Creative Assembly do have in mind, as Ind has received a bunch of references in Total War Warhammer 3 through the Realm of Chaos map, and even obviously in Immortal Empires. Then there's been lore updates, which is very important to talk about, as if something's getting lore updates, that means it remains in canon. The landmass is there, and we know it's going to be eventually opened up. I imagine that it's going to be for, minor factions at first, and then in the future, maybe a year, 2 years down the line, we'll start to see that happen. And like I said in the Nippon video, it's really curious that we didn't get a full map of Grand Cafe when they did the full Grand Cafe reveal. Well, it was more confirming that it was going to be part of the tabletop too. This is Games Workshop, by the way. And like I said there, it's likely because they've got some map ideas for Koresh, Ind, and Nippon that we're going to see in the future, but right now they don't want to show that yet, because if they start hinting at it now, people are going to start going, well, where's this DLC? Where are the miniatures? Where's the concept art? Where's the lore? A big thing that needs to be taken into account that we've already started seeing is that lore updates are happening, and that Old World is likely going to be going into these areas that were never done before, that they had plans. Games Workshop did have plans for Ind and Nippon and Koresh, very similar to how they had plans for Grand Cafe, and that's now getting done, but it's an easy way for them to get miniatures. Again, this is cross-promotion, which, is something that is going to be very useful. Games Workshop and Creative Assembly have finally learned how to do this. I've discussed this in the previous video, but it's a bit disappointing that they're taking this time, it's a 7-year-old series at this point. However, better late than never, as long as this gets us new stuff to play with. Because, yeah, Lord Packs are cool, but there's only so much that you could do with Lord Packs. Where if you start deciding to do more race packs, hey, that's going to bring big money. Plus, again, with Games Workshop and Old World, we know that Games Workshop want to expand into the eastern portions of our real world. So what better way to start getting some money from India than, doing the whole cross-reference thing. This is your world, this is your country, this is your mythology, but done in a different way, in a respectful way, of course, very similar to how Grand Cafe was done, but hey, it worked with Grand Cafe, it's likely going to work with everything else, as long as it's done well. Games Workshop can screw this up, keep that in mind. But as long as they've done some proper research, hopefully, knock on wood, this should be done well, and it should generate some sales for them. Now, before we end this video, I kind of want to share my vision on how Ind would be in a Total War or Warhammer perspective, as I know a lot of people would probably be thinking, oh, it's just another human faction, but sometimes human factions could be cool if they're done in a different way. So, rather than being very similar to the Empire and so on, they would be a more fantastical approach than even Grand Cafe had. So we'd have a lot of humans, I'd say early medieval to all the way to gunpowder based India, because that obviously does make sense. And I know some people are already going, well, that's too similar to the Empire Grand Cafe, but yeah, a lot of gunpowder does pass by the Warhammer fantasy world. Human nations will trade, and if they're trading, they're going to get their hands on gunpowder. But then they would be flanked by loads of fantastical beasts, and I'm not just saying big single entity monsters, but a lot of monsters, where I would see a half and half approach when it comes to the roster. Half of it being humans, your baseline, front line, all that type of stuff, but then everything else would be fantastical monsters. Like we already know, we've got the winged lions, we've got the 6-armed monkey warriors, the tiger men, obviously then going into Indian mythology to get more creatures from there to be able to have a little bit of a mix. Kind of like Norska is a half and half, but Norska is just really boring because the half and half just doesn't look like it, as most of the Norskan roster for the monsters is just either fast or big monster, right? Here it would be fast, big monsters, flyers, this, that, or the other, just loads and loads of creatures. The great thing is that a race pack is normally quite full. If you compare, say for example, the Vampire Coast, which has a massive roster, that's the newest standard obviously, we're expecting a full roster, not like what the Norskins had, or the early Warriors of Chaos, which was just kind of bare, so it leaves for a lot of spots for different types of creatures. But the big thing for me is that they could do something very, very interesting with their legendary lords. So, we know this is the land of 1,000 gods, so what if the gods themselves were the legendary lords? Gods roaming the world itself is actually not out of the question, and it would be kind of cool. It would be very similar in a sense to Grand Cafe right now, as the Dragon Emperor, the Moon Empress, and even the Dragon Children are kind of seen like gods by people outside of Cafe, not Cafe themselves, that's kind of forbidden, but you know what I mean. But what if the actual gods were roaming and taking part with the day-to-day life of the subjects of the Kingdoms of Ind? They know better than anyone else that the way that a faith stays strong is if they are active with their servants. And since Ind itself is going to be dealing with, you know, Chaos Dwarves, Mountains of Morn, so the ogres, demons, well, pretty much any threat, and obviously I'm imagining that Koresh would also launch assaults into Ind, having the gods there as an extra defense just kind of makes a lot of sense, and it would be kind of cool. Cool factor is a big thing here, and I think it could be done pretty well. Obviously time will have to tell, but I'm really curious about the Kingdoms of Ind, and I've been super curious about them ever since I learnt about them in lore many, many years ago. It's one of those things where a blank slate, there's so much potential. There is literally so much potential to make it as interesting as possible while still respective to the source material, obviously, you know, the real, like, religions and mythology. So yeah, it's all about a waiting game. I think it's going to be one of the race packs that we're going to see in the next 2-3 years, because it just kind of makes sense for Ind, given the landmass and so on. Maybe they'll go for Koresh first. We'll talk about Koresh another day. But I feel like Ind could be next, because a lot of the human stuff, you know, that rigging is the stuff that they can reuse from the Empire, from Bretonnia, from Cafe. And then going into the monster stuff, well, we don't know what type of monsters they could really much have. If any of you have any idea, if you know the mythology, obviously you're going to know it better than I would. Do give some suggestions down in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys want to see Ind as a DLC in Total War Warhammer 3? Would you like to see them in Warhammer the Old World? I would just love to see as much of this universe fleshed out as possible, before Games Workshop start realizing that there's no Space Marines here, which is a legitimate fear of mine, because, yeah, it's kind of known. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion.